Thank you, Mr Chair. What an extraordinary contribution from the member who first drafted and passed into law the very clause that we're now deleting. The very clause we're now deleting is the clause that Tau Henare drafted and passed into law. And I asked him a question when he was on his feet, which was, why did the National Party promise not to implement this bill and clause 6A, not to extend it to private training establishments? Why did they promise at the last election that they would not do this when they're sitting here tonight voting for it? Why? They've all gone very, very quiet now because they know that there is no mandate for clause 6A. There is no mandate for extending these provisions to private training establishments. This is because the ACT Party, a 2% party on a good day, cannot get the 10% support required to force a referendum. Because if an institution wants voluntary membership, all they have to do, like a private training establishment, all they would have to do is get 10% of their members to agree to a referendum, and a referendum would be held democratically for that private training establishment to determine whether or not they wanted to go voluntary. That's all that's required, 10%. And they can't do it. They cannot do it. So we're sitting here in Parliament today forcing through legislation to force upon students who have said democratically that they do not want this in their private training establishments. And Mr Henare talked about everything under the sun and barely mentioned private training establishments. This extends it to private training establishments. The ACT Party cannot even get 10% support from those students to have a referendum to let them decide.
Point of order, Honourable Chairman.
And I apologise for interrupting. Sir, I did notice you signalling to that member to restrict her comments, sir. I spent time...
No, you don't... Look, I asked the member to resume the seat. I have, on numerous occasions, asked members to come back to 6A. Instead of standing and by way of an order, I often try and get member to come back to the point, 6A. And that's what we're debating. Now, that's what I normally do. It's a practice I've followed for a long time, and it's just to indicate to the member to come back to and bring some relevance back to the clause that we're debating. Moana Maki. Point of order.
Mr Chairman, and sir, that is, I think, a good practice. It's one which good speakers have used as well. The issue I have, sir, I couldn't see you all of the time while Mr Peachy was speaking, but I listened to his speech from the House.
No, look, that's not a point of order. I'll ask the member to resume his seat. I'll ask them. Look, I will determine the relevancy of the speeches. I have brought members back to clause 6A. And I will do it as I see it at the time, and that's the way that I've ruled. And I'm asking Moana Maki to continue. Point of order, the Honourable Chairman.
The point that I'm getting to, if I'm able to, sir, is a request for you to do that on a consistent basis. I was here for Tau Henare's speech, sir. I did not see you do that to him at all, and he gave a history of the world rather than addressing the bill.
I did actually tell him to come back to 6A. Now, I'll ask Moana Maki to continue.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Part 6A, of course, extends the previous provisions in Part 6 to private training establishments, and that's what I've been discussing. And the point that I was making was that all that is required under current law is that 10%, a measly 10% of students sign a petition to say that they want a referendum, and a referendum will be held. 10%. Now, apparently, that this is such a huge problem that we need to get rid of it, and students don't want it, and yet the ACT Party cannot even get 10% of students to call a referendum so that that private training establishment can determine for themselves whether or not they want to be voluntary or compulsory in terms of their student association fees. 10%. Now, we could be standing here, Mr Speaker, instead discussing, as Labour wanted to, if that threshold is too high, If private training establishments should only have to get 5% of students to force a referendum, then that's fine, let's have that discussion. But we are here in Parliament legislating over the top of the democratic rights of students to determine for themselves whether or not their associations are voluntary or compulsory, because the ACT Party couldn't even get 10% of students to agree with them. There is no mandate to extend this to private training establishments at all. No mandate. This is a party on less than 2%. Less than 2%. And the National Party promised that they wouldn't extend this to private training establishments. At the last election, they said there is no way we will support this. They gave that commitment to students. They said to those in private training establishments, we will not vote for this. So 2% of parties went to the last election promising this change. 2%. And Heather Roy says she has a mandate to do this. There is no mandate. This isn't about choice. This removes choice. It removes choice from those students in private training establishments. It removes choice. On Tau Henare interjects, this is the man who wrote this clause, who gave this great eloquent speech about why it should be gotten rid of, and failed to mention the fact that he was the member who drafted it in the first place. He was the member. That's Tau Henare. He can argue both sides of any argument. He can belong to any political party he wants to, ACDC, which is why he has belonged to so many political parties. But this clause is bad news for those students in private training establishments because it removes their choice. And this from a so-called party of choice, because now there will be no choice as to whether a student association is voluntary or compulsory. There will be no choice in private training establishments. They will only be able to have what the 2% ACT Party, Mr Chair, thank you, Mr Chair, they will only be able to have the option that the 2% ACT Party wants them to have. Doesn't matter that they've democratically, in some cases, chosen that they want compulsory student association membership. That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. Doesn't matter that provisions exist already for those who want to conscientiously object to do so. And if the clauses for conscientious objection for those students in private training establishments are not strong enough, then let's talk about that. Let's have that discussion. That's what Labour wanted to do when we said we want to talk to Heather Roy and to the government about finding an enduring solution for private training establishments, an enduring solution so that this doesn't become the political football. And we were told no, they didn't want to do this. The 2% party wanted to force this through because they know they'll never be able to get it through on the campuses of New Zealand. They know they've lost that debate. They know the private training establishments aren't going to support them in their ideological drive to get rid of political opposition and to get rid of those voices of student associations that might disagree with them. They know they can't do that on the campuses of private training establishments, so they have to come to Parliament to force through legislation that there is no mandate for. No mandate for. And that removes choice. And I look forward to the next National Party Speaker who gets up on Clause 6A and waxes lyrical about how great this is and how fantastic it is that this is going to be great for students. And I want to hear from them, why then did they promise that they wouldn't do this? Why then did they go to the last election promising not to vote for Clause 6A, not to vote for this legislation? Why did they go to the NZUSA conference and say National will not vote for Clause 6A, we will not vote for this bill? And that's what I want to hear from the next National Party Speaker, because they all get very excited about this clause 6A, but they fail to mention that they're breaking a major election promise by doing so. Breaking a major election promise. It was an election promise. It was an election promise. Go ask Paul Hutchison. Go ask Paul Hutchison, who went to the NZUSA conference and promised that National would not support this clause and that National would not support this legislation. And that's why Labour has been opposing this clause and this legislation. This so hard has been because of the fact that there is no mandate for it. No mandate for it. 2% of the country voted for. Oh, it's called a majority, says Tohana. So why can't that apply on the campuses of New Zealand? If it's called a majority, why can that not apply to the campuses of New Zealand so that they can have a vote, just as Mr Henare is interjecting and saying that he should be allowed to in this House? Why is it one rule for the National Party in Tau Henare and another for the students and private training establishments around New Zealand? Why? He says, oh, we won, you lost. Oh, We won, you lost. Apparently democracy is important in this place, but nowhere else, if it doesn't suit Mr Henare. If it doesn't suit Mr Henare. Well, we support... We support democracy on the campuses of New Zealand. I feel sorry for Heather Roy that she wasn't able to get 10% of students to agree to a referendum. That must have been very discouraging. It must have been very embarrassing. She probably thought private training establishments were the area that she was going to be able to get traction. Well, she couldn't get 10% support. How hard could that be if this is such a major issue that we need to legislate over the rights of all students in order to fix it? 10%, Mr Boscawen. 10%. That's all you needed to get, Mr Boscawen, on the campuses of private training establishments. And ACT couldn't do it. They failed. They failed. So here we are in Parliament on a bill that has no mandate, that party over there said they would not support. And 2%, a party on less than 2%, is going to force this law change on all students, even though they've said they don't want it, even though they've said they don't want it, even though they've voted on it in private training establishments and other campuses around the country. They voted, Mr Boscawen, and they said they wanted the choice. Choice, remember choice? Remember choice? That used to be what the ACT Party was about. Not anymore, because if you don't choose what the ACT Party wants, then they'll legislate over the top of your rights. That's the true ACT Party. That's what we're doing here in this Parliament. That's what we're doing in Clause 6A, which removes choice from those students in private training establishments to be able to determine for themselves, not what the ACT Party thinks is good for them, to be able to determine for themselves what they want in terms of their students' association. What's so wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with it is there's an ideological bent from the ACT Party to get rid of them.
Gareth Hughes.
Mr Chair, I'd like to follow that fiery, passionate speech by